I knew the HOA in my neighborhood was bad, but I never thought they'd take it this far. I came home from work to find my front porch, my beautiful, custom-built porch, completely gone. Not damaged. Not altered. Gone. In its place was a pile of debris, shattered wood, and tire tracks from the bulldozer that had been used to demolish it. I stood there, gripping my car keys so tightly my knuckles turned white. And then I saw her. Margaret Delacroix, the self-appointed queen of the HOA, stood at the edge of my property with a smug look on her face, arms crossed like she had personally done me a favor. "I told you, Benjamin," she said, her voice dripping with condescension. "That porch violated neighborhood aesthetics." We had no choice but to take action. I took a deep breath, forcing myself to stay calm. "You demolished my property, Margaret," she scoffed. "It was an eyesore." "The HOA board voted unanimously that it had to go. You should have followed the guidelines." I knew exactly what guidelines she was talking about because I wrote them. Margaret had no idea who she was messing with. Before I moved into this neighborhood, before I had to deal with her ridiculous power trips, I worked as a zoning and land use attorney for the city. I had spent years drafting the regulations that governed construction, property rights, and most importantly, what HOAs could and could not do. And what Margaret had just done. Oh, she had messed up. Big time. I exhaled slowly, surveying the damage. My porch wasn't just some rickety wooden deck. I had built it myself, every nail, every beam, every carefully measured step. It was perfectly within zoning laws. It didn't violate setback requirements, height restrictions, or even the HOA's own architectural standards. Margaret had bulldozed it because she didn't like it, not because it was illegal. "Margaret," I said, my voice calm but firm, "you just made the biggest mistake of your life." Her expression flickered for a moment, but she quickly regained her smug confidence. "Oh, please. If you have a complaint, take it up with the HOA board, but I doubt they'll side with you." I didn't need the HOA board. I had something much better. I pulled out my phone and snapped a picture of the destruction. Then I took another of Margaret standing there, arms crossed, looking proud of herself. "Oh, don't bother calling the police," she said, waving a dismissive hand. "This was a board-approved action." I laughed. I actually laughed. "Oh, I'm not calling the police, Margaret. I'm calling my lawyer." For the first time, her face paled. "You see," I continued, stepping closer, "you just illegally destroyed private property. And I know for a fact that the HOA doesn't have the authority to do that, because I'm the one who wrote the zoning laws that govern this entire neighborhood." Margaret's mouth opened, then closed. "That's ridiculous." "Is it?" I pulled up the city's zoning codes on my phone and scrolled down to the sections I had personally written. According to Municipal Code Section 27, subsection B, an HOA cannot unilaterally demolish private structures without due process, permits, and explicit homeowner consent. "You didn't get any of those." Margaret's smugness evaporated. The board," I interrupted. "The board doesn't override city law." "And you, Margaret, just authorized illegal property destruction. That's a felony." Her face turned a shade of white I had never seen before. I took another picture of the wreckage before turning to my house. "You'll be hearing from my lawyer by the end of the day. And I hope the HOA has deep pockets because this is going to cost you." Margaret didn't say another word. She just stood there frozen as I walked past her into my house. She had no idea how badly she had just screwed up, but she was about to find out. I set my phone down on the kitchen counter and took a deep breath, forcing myself to stay level-headed. The anger simmering beneath my skin wasn't going to help me think clearly, and clarity was exactly what I needed right now. Margaret had made a severe miscalculation, assuming I was just another homeowner she could intimidate. But she didn't know who she was dealing with. I grabbed a notebook from the drawer and started documenting everything in detail while the events were fresh in my mind. The time I arrived home, the exact condition of my property. Margaret's comments, the presence of tire tracks and construction debris. Every little detail mattered in cases like this, and I wasn't going to leave anything to chance. Once I had everything documented, I made a few calls. First, to a trusted colleague of mine, a real estate attorney I had worked with in the past. He picked up on the second ring, and after I explained the situation, he let out a low whistle. "That's about the dumbest thing an HOA could do," he said. "You have photos." "Witnesses? I have everything," I confirmed, "and I'm going to need an official cease and desist drafted by the end of the day." "Easily done. I'll also file for immediate damages." "They'll be served before they even have a chance to spin this." That was exactly what I wanted to hear. The next call I made was to the city's zoning enforcement office. I still had plenty of contacts from my time working there, and it didn't take long to get in touch with someone who could help. I explained what had happened, and within minutes, they were pulling up records for any demolition permits issued in my neighborhood. As expected, there were none. That meant Margaret and her HOA cronies had hired a demolition crew without proper authorization, another legal violation to add to the growing list. The zoning officer assured me they would be following up with an official investigation. I hung up and allowed myself a small moment of satisfaction. Margaret had made this personal, but I was going to make it professional. The next morning, I woke up early and immediately checked my email. My attorney had already sent over the cease and desist letter, along with a drafted lawsuit claiming damages for unlawful destruction of private property. I printed everything out and tucked the documents into a folder before heading out. As I stepped outside, I noticed something that made my blood boil all over again. Margaret was in my driveway. She was standing there with two other HOA board members, speaking in hushed tones. As soon as I approached, they stopped talking, but I caught the nervous glances they exchanged. I didn't give them the chance to start whatever nonsense they had planned. I pulled out the folder of legal documents and handed Margaret the cease and desist letter. "You've been officially served," I said. "I suggest you read that carefully, because if you so much as step foot on my property again, I'll have legal grounds to escalate this even further." Margaret's face twisted in a half-hearted attempt at indignation, but I could see the uncertainty in her eyes. She wasn't used to people fighting back. One of the board members, a wiry man with thin-rimmed glasses, cleared his throat. "Now, let's not be hasty. We were just discussing how we might come to an amicable resolution." I folded my arms. "An amicable resolution would have been discussing this before you had my porch destroyed." Margaret pursed her lips. "We were simply enforcing neighborhood standards." I didn't even blink. "Oh, really? Then why didn't you file for a demolition permit? Why didn't you notify the city? Why didn't you follow any of the legal procedures required for something like this?" The second board member, a woman with short cropped hair, shifted uncomfortably. Margaret's silence was answer enough. I took another step forward and lowered my voice. "You didn't just overstep your authority, you committed a crime, and I have a lawsuit ready to go. By the end of the week, this HOA will be drowning in legal fees and fines." Margaret's bravado cracked. "You wouldn't," I cut her off. "I already have. My attorney is filing today. And I've reported you to the city. Expect an investigation." The color drained from her face, and this time she didn't have a retort. I turned on my heel without another word and walked back inside, leaving them standing there in stunned silence. By the time the lawsuit was officially filed, word had spread through the neighborhood like wildfire. Homeowners were furious not just about my porch, but about the HOA's history of overreach. People started digging through old records, uncovering years of questionable fines, arbitrary rule changes, and other abuses of power. And then came the final blow. The city's zoning office concluded their investigation and issued a formal statement. Not only had the HOA acted illegally, but they had also used HOA funds, homeowner dues, to pay for the unauthorized demolition. That meant every resident in the neighborhood had unknowingly funded Margaret's vendetta. The outrage was immediate. A petition to remove the entire board gained traction overnight. Homeowners who had once been too afraid to speak out were now demanding accountability. Margaret tried to spin the situation, claiming it was all a misunderstanding, but it was too late. The evidence was overwhelming. At the next emergency HOA meeting, the board faced an angry crowd demanding answers. One by one, residents took the microphone, sharing their own experiences of unfair treatment, excessive fines, and intimidation tactics. When it was my turn to speak, I didn't hold back. I laid out every legal violation, every misstep, and every consequence they were about to face. The room was dead silent by the time I finished. Margaret's reign was over, and within a week, she and the rest of the board had no choice but to resign. As for my porch, the HOA was ordered to pay for every penny of its reconstruction along with additional damages. In the end, justice wasn't just served. It was built back, one nail at a time. With the lawsuit filed and Margaret's grip on the HOA slipping, the neighborhood had transformed overnight. Homeowners who had once been too afraid to challenge the board were now rallying together, demanding transparency and accountability. The air buzzed with the energy of long-suppressed frustration finally boiling over. But Margaret wasn't the type to retreat quietly. 3 days after the emergency meeting, I received an official-looking envelope in my mailbox. I opened it on my front porch, standing where my demolished deck used to be. Inside was a letter from the HOA's lawyer, clearly someone Margaret had scrambled to hire in a last-ditch effort to salvage her position. The letter accused me of inciting discord within the community and violating HOA bylaws by publicly disparaging board members. It threatened further legal action if I continued my campaign of defamation. I let out a dry chuckle. Defamation? Everything I had presented was backed by evidence, from the illegal demolition to the misuse of HOA funds. This wasn't defamation, it was the truth, and Margaret was panicking. I walked back inside, placed the letter on my desk, and drafted a response. My attorney would handle the legal technicalities, but I wanted to make something crystal clear to Margaret and her dwindling allies. By the end of the afternoon, I had hand-delivered my own letter to the HOA's office. It was concise, professional, and lethal. I pointed out that any further threats of baseless legal action could be considered harassment, and that I would not hesitate to pursue legal recourse if they continued. The letter also included one final blow, a formal request for a forensic audit of the HOA's finances. If there was one thing I was certain of, it was that Margaret had been mismanaging funds for years. The next morning, the neighborhood was buzzing again. Word had spread that the HOA was being forced to open its financial records for review. Homeowners gathered in small groups, murmuring about misallocated fees, unexplained expenses, and suspicious charges that had never been properly disclosed. Later that day, an independent auditor arrived, clipboard in hand, ready to dig through every transaction the HOA had made under Margaret's leadership. I stood at my front window, watching as Margaret stormed down the sidewalk toward the HOA office, her posture rigid with barely contained fury. She was losing control, and she knew it. By the end of the week, the preliminary audit results were in, and they were worse than I had anticipated. Thousands of dollars had been funneled into administrative costs that had no clear documentation. Payments had been made to contractors with no corresponding work orders. And then, there was the biggest revelation of all. Margaret had been reimbursing herself for HOA-related expenses that had absolutely nothing to do with neighborhood maintenance. The moment the audit results were shared with the community, the outrage reached a breaking point. Homeowners who had been on the fence about removing the board were now demanding immediate action. That evening, another emergency HOA meeting was called, but this time, Margaret had no control over it. A petition to remove her had already gained enough signatures, and the community wasn't interested in hearing her excuses. As I arrived at the meeting, the room was packed wall to wall with residents, their faces set in grim determination. Margaret sat at the front, flanked by the last few board members still loyal to her, but even they looked uneasy. The meeting began with a homeowner standing up and reading aloud the findings of the audit. Every misused dollar, every shady transaction, it was all laid out for everyone to hear. Margaret sat stiffly, her hands gripping the edges of the table in front of her as she listened to her financial misdeeds being laid bare. When the homeowner finished, the room erupted in angry murmurs. People were shaking their heads, muttering about where their money had gone, about the ridiculous fines they had been forced to pay while Margaret had been lining her pockets. Then the vote to remove her began. Ballots had been prepared in advance, and one by one, homeowners marked their decisions and placed them in a collection box at the front. The count was swift. The final tally was announced. Margaret was out. By an overwhelming majority, she had been officially removed from the board. She stood abruptly, knocking over her chair in the process. Her face was a mask of disbelief, her mouth opening and closing as if searching for an argument that would reverse the inevitable. But there was nothing left to say. 2 days later, she packed up and moved out of the neighborhood entirely. With Margaret gone, the community quickly moved to elect a new board, one that prioritized transparency and fairness. The first order of business: reimbursing homeowners for the bogus fines Margaret had issued and restoring the properties she had wrongfully targeted, including mine. By the end of the following month, my porch was rebuilt, exactly as it had been before Margaret's power trip destroyed it. Only this time, it stood as a symbol of something greater, a neighborhood that had reclaimed its voice, free from the tyranny of an overreaching HOA. As I sat on my newly restored porch, sipping coffee and watching neighbors chat freely without fear of arbitrary fines or harassment, I allowed myself a moment of reflection. Margaret had bulldozed my property thinking she could get away with it, but in the end, she had only managed to demolish her own reign. With the HOA purged of Margaret's influence, the community had entered a new chapter 1, where homeowners no longer lived under the constant threat of arbitrary fines and intimidation. But while the worst was over, I knew from experience that cleaning up the mess left behind by corruption was never a quick process. The damage Margaret had done ran deep, and undoing it would take time. The first order of business was the financial recovery effort. The forensic audit had exposed the extent of Margaret's misuse of funds, but simply knowing the truth wasn't enough. The new HOA board, now composed of reasonable and competent members, had to decide how to handle the financial shortfall. The missing money needed to be accounted for, and homeowners deserved restitution. I had been asked to assist in reviewing the HOA's financial records further, and as I pored through the spreadsheets, it became clear that Margaret's mismanagement wasn't just limited to personal reimbursements. She had also funneled money into overpriced contracts with questionable vendors. Some of these companies didn't even seem to exist outside of a few vague invoices. The new board launched an inquiry into these irregularities, and within days, it was confirmed that at least 3 of the contractors Margaret had hired had direct ties to her family members. In other words, She had been using HOA funds to enrich people close to her under the guise of neighborhood improvements that never actually materialized. Armed with this new evidence, the board moved swiftly. A civil lawsuit was filed against Margaret, seeking to recover the misappropriated funds. Additionally, the city's fraud division had been alerted, and an investigation into her financial dealings was officially underway. Meanwhile, the neighborhood itself was undergoing a transformation. Without Margaret's oppressive influence, homeowners began making long-delayed improvements to their properties. The arbitrary restrictions she had imposed were lifted, and suddenly, the community was filled with the sound of renovations. New fences were being built, front yards were being redesigned, and long-neglected homes were finally getting the care they deserved. For the first time in years, the neighborhood actually felt like a community rather than a collection of people living under the rule of an unchecked dictator. But Margaret's departure didn't mean she had disappeared entirely. Despite being removed from the board and facing legal action, she still had a handful of loyalists in the neighborhood people who had benefited from her favoritism. These individuals were determined to stir up resistance against the new leadership, hoping to regain some semblance of the control they had lost. One evening, I was approached by one such holdout, a man named Harold, who had been one of Margaret's staunchest supporters. He had always enjoyed special privileges under her rule, avoiding fines that others had been slapped with, and receiving preferential treatment when it came to HOA matters. Harold made it clear that he wasn't happy about the direction things were going. He accused the new board of being too lenient, and claimed that without strict enforcement, the neighborhood would fall into chaos. I listened patiently, but when he started insinuating that Margaret had been unfairly targeted, I cut him off. The facts were indisputable, and no amount of revisionist history would change what had happened. Margaret had broken the law, mismanaged funds, and used her position to bulldoze people's rights quite literally in my case. Harold left in a huff, but his visit was a reminder that while Margaret was gone, the remnants of her influence weren't erased overnight. There would always be those who clung to the old way of doing things, unwilling to accept change. Despite the lingering resistance from a small faction, the majority of homeowners were fully on board with the new direction. The HOA board implemented new transparency measures, ensuring that all financial records were accessible to residents. Homeowners were now given a voice in decision-making, and rules were enforced fairly rather than selectively. As for my lawsuit against Margaret, it progressed swiftly. The evidence was overwhelming, and with the forensic audit findings backing my case, there was little room for her to maneuver. Her lawyers attempted to negotiate a settlement, but I refused to back down. This wasn't just about money, it was about accountability. When the court date finally arrived, Margaret was forced to sit in front of a judge and answer for her actions. The judge didn't take kindly to her excuses, and within minutes, it was clear that her defense was crumbling. The ruling was swift. Margaret was found liable for the damages, and she was ordered to pay not only for the reconstruction of my porch, but also additional punitive damages for the unlawful destruction of private property. With that, the final nail was hammered into the coffin of Margaret's reign. In the months that followed, the neighborhood continued to thrive. The toxic atmosphere that had once hung over the community had dissipated, replaced by a sense of unity and shared purpose. Homeowners who had once been afraid to challenge authority now actively participated in meetings, ensuring that no one person could ever hold unchecked power again. One evening, as I sat on my newly rebuilt porch, I watched as neighbors gathered in the cul-de-sac, chatting and laughing freely. The fear that had once governed their interactions was gone, replaced by something Margaret had never been able to understand: mutual respect. As I took a sip of my drink, a familiar face approached. It was the new HOA president, a level-headed woman named Lisa who had been instrumental in the neighborhood's transformation. She sat down beside me and let out a satisfied sigh, looking around at the peaceful scene before us. The battle against Margaret had been long and exhausting, but in the end, the neighborhood had won. And as I sat there, watching the community thrive in her absence, I knew that justice hadn't just been served, it had been cemented into the very foundation of this neighborhood's future. With Margaret gone and the new HOA board firmly in place, the neighborhood had entered a phase of healing. But just because the worst of the storm had passed didn't mean the cleanup was over. There were still lingering issues that needed attention, and as much as I wanted to sit back and enjoy my restored porch, I wasn't about to let loose ends dangle. The biggest concern was the financial state of the HOA. While the forensic audit had exposed Margaret's mismanagement, it had also revealed another problem: several contracts had been left in limbo. Some vendors had been paid in advance for work they never completed, and others had been hired under questionable circumstances. The new board had to decide whether to attempt to reclaim the funds or write them off as losses. Lisa, the newly elected HOA president, had asked me to review some of the legal options, and as I sifted through the paperwork, I found something particularly interesting. One of the companies that Margaret had hired an alleged landscaping service had been paid tens of thousands of dollars for community beautification projects. Yet, not a single documented improvement had been made under their contract. The company itself was nothing more than a front-of-shell business with no legitimate operations. Margaret had funneled HOA funds into it, and now, with her gone, the board was left holding the bill. I called Lisa and explained the situation. She was just as frustrated as I was. The board had already decided to pursue legal action against Margaret for the money she had personally misappropriated, but this was a separate issue. If the funds could be recovered, they could be used for actual community improvements, something the neighborhood desperately needed after years of neglect. Lisa and I met with the rest of the board to discuss the next steps. There was some debate about whether it was worth the effort to chase down the fraudulent payments, but I insisted that it was. Letting this slide would set a dangerous precedent, one that could invite future corruption. After some discussion, the board voted to formally pursue legal action against the fraudulent landscaping company. A report was filed with the city's fraud division, and within days, an investigation was launched. As that legal battle was brewing, another issue surfaced. Margaret's former allies were still trying to stir up trouble. While they no longer had any official power, they were doing their best to create chaos. A few of them started spreading rumors that the new HOA board was too weak, and that without strict enforcement, the neighborhood would deteriorate. It was absurd. In just a few months, the community had made more positive progress than it had in years under Margaret's rule. Homes were being improved, residents were actually engaging in discussions instead of living in fear, and for the first time, people felt like they had a say in how the neighborhood was run. But Margaret's supporters weren't just relying on words, they were trying to undermine the board's authority by refusing to comply with basic community standards. One homeowner deliberately let their lawn grow wild, claiming that since the new board wasn't handing out fines the way Margaret had, they didn't have to maintain their property. Another started parking an RV on their front lawn, daring the board to do something about it. Lisa and the rest of the board were torn on how to handle it. They didn't want to fall into the same authoritarian patterns that had made Margaret's rule so unbearable, but they also couldn't allow a few bad actors to set a new precedent for disorder. I suggested a different approach rather than resorting to fines and threats. They should take a community-driven approach. Instead of citing rule violations, they should engage with the homeowners directly, explaining why the standards existed and how they benefited everyone. It wasn't an instant fix, but it worked. Without the fear-driven enforcement Margaret had relied on, her former allies quickly found themselves isolated. When the rest of the neighborhood didn't support their attempts at rebellion, they had no choice but to fall in line. Meanwhile, the fraud investigation into the landscaping company had turned up some damning evidence. Not only had Margaret funneled HOA funds into the business, but she had also personally received kickbacks from the payments. The fraudulent company was tied directly to a distant relative of hers, and bank records showed that a portion of the money had found its way back into Margaret's personal accounts. This new revelation changed everything. The civil case against Margaret had already been strong, but now there was potential for criminal charges. The city prosecutor got involved, and suddenly, Margaret was facing far more than just financial penalties. She was looking at possible jail time. When the news broke, the neighborhood erupted in a mix of shock and satisfaction. Margaret had always acted as if she was untouchable, but now she was facing the full weight of the law. Despite everything, I wasn't interested in revenge. Justice was enough. Margaret had built her power on intimidation and manipulation, and now that foundation had crumbled beneath her. The final months of the year saw even more improvements in the neighborhood. With recovered funds from the fraudulent contracts, the HOA was able to invest in real community projects, repairing sidewalks, upgrading streetlights, and even creating a small park for families to enjoy. The transformation was undeniable. Where there had once been fear and resentment, there was now cooperation and pride. One evening, as I sat on my porch, Lisa stopped by to give me an update on the latest developments. The city prosecutor had officially filed charges against Margaret for fraud and embezzlement. Her legal troubles were far from over. I wasn't surprised. Margaret had spent years abusing her authority, convinced that she was above consequences. But no one was above the law, not even an HOA tyrant. As Lisa and I watched the sun set over the revitalized neighborhood, I realized just how far we had come. Margaret had tried to tear me down literally, but in the end, she had only destroyed herself. The community had won, and this time it was built to last. With Margaret's legal troubles escalating and the neighborhood moving forward under new leadership, I finally had room to breathe. The battle had been long and exhausting, but every step, every document, every confrontation, every legal maneuver had been worth it. The community had reclaimed its voice, and Margaret, once the self-appointed queen of the HOA, was now a cautionary tale. But even as things settled, loose ends remained. The fraud investigation had uncovered more than just Margaret's misdeeds. In reviewing additional financial transactions tied to the HOA, Lisa and I had stumbled upon another troubling discovery, one that didn't just implicate Margaret, but someone still living in the neighborhood. The fraudulent landscaping company Margaret had used as a front wasn't the only suspicious entity in the HOA's records. Buried in years of financial documents was another name, appearing under multiple consultation fees and administrative expenses. The payments weren't massive, but they were frequent, and they all led back to Harold, the same Harold who had tried to undermine the new board's authority after Margaret was removed. Lisa and I sat in her office, reviewing the documents one last time before making a decision on how to proceed. The evidence was clear. Harold had been receiving direct payments from the HOA under Margaret's leadership, disguised as official expenses. The funds weren't as substantial as what Margaret had siphoned away, but they had still been taken from homeowner dues under false pretenses. Lisa tapped her pen against the desk, deep in thought. She had proven to be an excellent leader, fair, transparent, and decisive. But this situation was delicate. Unlike Margaret, Harold hadn't been a dominant force in the HOA's leadership. He had been a loyalist, benefiting from her rule but never standing at the forefront. She finally looked up, resolve settling into her expression. The decision was clear. Harold had to be confronted. We called an emergency board meeting and requested Harold's presence, framing it as a routine financial review. He arrived looking confident, perhaps assuming the board was still too inexperienced to notice anything significant. That confidence faded the moment Lisa laid the documents in front of him. His fingers tightened around the chair's armrests as he read through the numbers, his face growing paler with each passing second. He tried to play it off at first, claiming the payments were legitimate reimbursements for consulting work he had done for the HOA. But when pressed for details, what exactly he had consulted on, where the documentation was, why no one else had ever been made aware of these transactions, he had no real answers. Lisa didn't raise her voice, didn't resort to intimidation. She simply laid out the facts, giving Harold the opportunity to explain himself. But there was nothing he could say that would justify what had been uncovered. After a long, tense silence, he finally leaned forward, his voice quieter than usual. He started with excuses about how Margaret had been the one to handle finances, how he had just been following her lead, how he hadn't intended to do anything wrong. But the truth was undeniable. He had taken money that didn't belong to him, and now he had to face the consequences. Lisa gave him two choices: resign from the HOA entirely and allow the board to reclaim the funds through a structured repayment plan, or face legal action. Harold didn't argue. He didn't protest. He simply nodded, signed the resignation paperwork Lisa had already prepared, and left without another word. With Harold gone, the last remnants of Margaret's influence had been scrubbed from the HOA. The board moved swiftly to recover the misused funds, reallocating them toward much-needed community improvements. The neighborhood, once plagued by fear and arbitrary enforcement, had transformed into a place where people actually wanted to live. The new leadership ensured that no single person would ever wield unchecked power again, implementing rules that required full transparency in all HOA decisions. Homeowners were given access to financial records, and any changes to neighborhood policies had to be voted on by residents rather than dictated from above. In the months that followed, the shift was undeniable. People who had once avoided HOA meetings now participated actively. Neighbors who had been at odds under Margaret's rule now worked together to improve the community. The air of hostility that had once lingered over the neighborhood was gone. As for Margaret, her legal troubles only worsened. With the fraud charges piling up and her financial misconduct fully exposed, she had no way out. The last I heard, she had taken a plea deal in an attempt to avoid a lengthy prison sentence. It was a fitting end for someone who had spent years believing she was untouchable. One evening, I sat on my rebuilt porch, watching the neighborhood thrive. Families walked their dogs without fear of receiving fabricated fines. Kids rode their bikes without being scolded for violating community safety standards. The oppressive reign of the HOA dictatorship had been dismantled, replaced with something far better: an actual community. Lisa stopped by, handing me a small envelope. Inside was a thank you note, signed by dozens of homeowners. I hadn't done any of this for recognition. I had done it because it was right. But as I looked at the signatures, I realized how much had truly changed. This wasn't just about taking down a corrupt HOA president. It was about taking back control, about refusing to be bullied, about ensuring no one else had to experience what I had. Margaret had tried to bulldoze my property, thinking she could erase what I had built. But in the end, she had only managed to destroy herself.